In the quiet village of Pine Hollow, an old man named Henry forms an unbreakable bond with a fiery fox named Ember after rescuing him as a pup. When Henry passes away, Ember's unwavering loyalty leads him to stand vigil at his grave, refusing to eat or leave. The villagers, moved by his devotion, help him find a new home at a wildlife sanctuary, where he begins to heal with the help of another fox, Willow. Ember's journey becomes a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and second chances, leaving a legacy that inspires all who hear his story. Welcome to Critters Planet, your go-to destination for heartwarming tales of animals and the extraordinary bonds they share with humans. From loyal foxes to brave dogs and everything in between, we celebrate the resilience, love, and loyalty of creatures big and small. Join us as we explore the incredible stories that remind us of the beauty and compassion found in the animal kingdom. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to be part of our growing community. The village of Pine Hollow was a quiet place, nestled at the edge of an ancient forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. The towering pines whispered secrets to the wind, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and moss. It was a place where time seemed to move slower, where the rhythms of nature dictated life more than the ticking of clocks. And on the very outskirts of this village, where the forest began to reclaim the land, stood a crumbling cottage with a crooked chimney and a sagging roof. This was the home of Henry Whitaker, an old man who had lived there for as long as anyone could remember. Henry was a figure of mystery in Pine Hollow. He kept to himself, rarely venturing into the village except to trade for supplies or to share a quiet word with Tobias, the farmer who lived a mile down the road. The villagers respected Henry's solitude, though they often whispered about him when they gathered at the local tavern. Some said he had once been a traveler, a man who had seen the world and chosen to settle in the forest to escape its chaos. Others claimed he was a hermit, a man broken by some long-forgotten tragedy. Whatever the truth, Henry's life was a quiet one, filled with the simple routines of chopping wood, tending his garden, and wandering the forest paths. But everything changed one winter evening, when a fierce storm swept through Pine Hollow. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the snow fell in thick, relentless sheets. Henry, bundled in his worn coat and scarf, had ventured into the forest to gather firewood before the storm grew worse. The villagers would later say it was madness to go out in such weather, but Henry had always been stubborn, and he knew the forest better than anyone. As he trudged through the snow, his lantern casting flickering shadows on the trees, Henry heard a faint sound, a high-pitched whimper, almost lost in the roar of the wind. He paused, tilting his head to listen. The sound came again, weak and desperate. Henry followed it, his boots crunching through the snow, until he found the source, a small, shivering fox pup, half buried in a drift. The pup was no bigger than a house cat, its fur a patchy mix of red and white. Its amber eyes, wide with fear, locked onto Henry's as it let out another pitiful whimper. Henry knelt down, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, and gently brushed the snow away from the pup's body. It was clear the little creature had been abandoned, or worse, orphaned. Its ribs were visible beneath its thin coat, and its tiny body trembled with exhaustion. Henry hesitated. He had lived alone for so long, his life defined by solitude and self-sufficiency. Taking in a wild animal, especially a fox, was not something he had ever considered. But as he looked into the pup's pleading eyes, something stirred in him, a memory, perhaps, of a time when he, too, had been alone and in need of kindness. "All right, little one," Henry murmured, his voice rough but gentle. "Let's get you out of the cold." He tucked the pup inside his coat, shielding it from the wind, and made his way back to the cottage. The storm raged around him, but Henry moved with purpose, his steps steady despite the snow that clung to his boots. When he finally reached the cottage, he pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside, the warmth of the hearth washing over him. Henry set the pup down by the fire, wrapping it in an old blanket. He rummaged through his pantry, finding a small bowl and some goat's milk he had traded for earlier that week. He warmed the milk over the fire and offered it to the pup, who lapped at it eagerly, its tiny tail wagging weakly. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" Henry said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He reached out to stroke the pup's fur, and to his surprise, it leaned into his touch, its trembling slowly subsiding. Over the next few days, Henry nursed the pup back to health. He fashioned a makeshift bed from an old crate and a pile of blankets, and he fed it a steady diet of milk, scraps of meat, and whatever else he could spare. The pup, which he began to call Ember for its fiery coat, grew stronger with each passing day. Its amber eyes, once clouded with fear, now sparkled with curiosity and trust. The villagers soon caught wind of Henry's new companion. It was Tobias who first spotted Ember, bounding after Henry on one of his rare trips to the village. The sight of the old man with a fox pup at his heels was enough to set tongues wagging. "Henry's gone and adopted a fox," Tobias told the others at the tavern. "A wild thing, no less. Can you imagine?" The villagers were divided in their opinions. Some admired Henry's kindness, seeing it as a testament to his gentle nature. Others shook their heads, muttering about the dangers of keeping a wild animal as a pet. "Mark my words," one man said, "that fox'll turn on him one day. You can't tame a wild thing." But Henry paid no mind to the whispers. He had always been a man who followed his own path, and he saw no reason to change now. Ember became a constant presence in his life, accompanying him on his walks through the forest, curling up by the fire at night, and even helping him in the garden by chasing away pests. The bond between man and fox grew stronger with each passing day, a quiet testament to the power of compassion and companionship. As the weeks turned into months, Ember grew from a scrawny pup into a magnificent fox, his coat a rich, fiery red that seemed to glow in the sunlight. His amber eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing, and his loyalty to Henry was unwavering. The villagers, though still wary, couldn't help but be captivated by the sight of the old man and his fox, walking side by side through the forest or sitting together on the porch of the cottage. But beneath the surface of this idyllic life, a quiet unease lingered. Henry was growing older, his steps slower, his hands more unsteady. He knew his time was limited, and he couldn't shake the fear of what would happen to Ember when he was gone. The fox, for all his wild instincts, had become dependent on Henry, and the thought of leaving him alone in the world was a heavy burden. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was bathed in a golden glow, Henry sat on the porch with Ember at his side. He scratched behind the fox's ears, his gaze distant. "You're a good lad, Ember," Henry said softly. "But I worry about you. What'll you do when I'm not here anymore?" Ember tilted his head, as if understanding the weight of Henry's words. He let out a soft whine and pressed his muzzle against Henry's hand, a gesture of comfort that brought a lump to the old man's throat. Henry sighed, his heart heavy with unspoken fears. He knew he couldn't protect Ember forever, but for now, he would cherish the time they had together. The bond they shared was a rare and precious thing, a reminder that even in the wildest of hearts, love and loyalty could take root. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Henry and Ember sat together in silence, the forest around them alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. It was a moment of peace, a fleeting respite from the worries that loomed on the horizon. But for now, it was enough. As the seasons turned, Ember grew from a scrawny, trembling pup into a sleek and majestic fox. His fiery red coat gleamed in the sunlight, and his amber eyes, sharp and intelligent, seemed to miss nothing. He was a creature of the forest, yet he had become something more, a companion, a protector, and a friend to Henry. The bond between the old man and the fox deepened with each passing day. Ember followed Henry everywhere, his paws patting softly on the forest floor as they wandered the winding trails together. Henry, who had once walked those paths in solitude, now found joy in sharing them with Ember. The fox's presence brought a new energy to his life, a spark of wildness that reminded him of the beauty and unpredictability of the natural world. The villagers of Pine Hollow, though still wary of Ember, couldn't help but be captivated by the sight of the unlikely pair. Children would peek from behind their mothers' skirts as Henry and Ember passed through the village, their eyes wide with wonder. Even the adults, who had once muttered about the dangers of keeping a wild animal, began to soften. There was something undeniably special about the bond between the old man and his fox. Tobias, the farmer who lived down the road, was one of the first to see the change in Henry. "You've got a shadow now, Henry," he said one day, as Henry traded a basket of wild mushrooms for a sack of flour. Ember sat at Henry's feet, his ears twitching at the sound of Tobias' voice. Henry chuckled, a rare sound that seemed to surprise even himself. "Aye, he's a good lad," he said, scratching Ember behind the ears. "Keeps me company, he does." Tobias nodded, though his expression was thoughtful. "Just be careful, Henry. A fox is still a wild thing, no matter how tame he seems." Henry didn't respond, but the words lingered in his mind. He knew Tobias meant well, but he also knew that Ember was different. The fox had chosen to stay with him, to trust him, and Henry couldn't imagine turning his back on that trust. As the months passed, Ember's loyalty to Henry became the stuff of legend in Pine Hollow. The villagers told stories of how the fox would stand guard outside Henry's cottage at night, his ears pricked and his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. They spoke of how Ember would bring Henry small gifts, a feather, a shiny stone, or even a freshly caught rabbit, as if to say thank you for the life they shared. One crisp autumn morning, Henry and Ember set out on their usual walk through the forest. The air was cool and crisp, and the leaves had turned to shades of gold and red. Henry moved more slowly now, his steps careful and deliberate, but Ember matched his pace, his tail swishing gently as he trotted beside him. They reached a clearing where the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Henry sat down on a fallen log, his breath coming in shallow puffs. Ember sat beside him, his amber eyes fixed on Henry's face. "Getting old, Ember," Henry said with a sigh, rubbing his knees. "Not as spry as I used to be." Ember let out a soft whine and pressed his muzzle against Henry's hand, as if to offer comfort. Henry smiled, his heart swelling with affection for the fox. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of dried meat, which he offered to Ember. The fox took it gently, his eyes never leaving Henry's face. As they sat together in the clearing, Henry's thoughts turned to the future. He knew his time was limited, and the thought of leaving Ember alone filled him with a deep, aching sadness. The fox had become his family, his reason for getting up each morning, and the thought of him wandering the forest alone, searching for a companion who would never return, was almost too much to bear. "What'll you do when I'm gone, lad?" Henry murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Ember tilted his head, his ears twitching, but he didn't respond. Henry sighed and leaned back against the log, his gaze drifting to the sky. The sound of rustling leaves drew Henry's attention, and he turned to see a young girl standing at the edge of the clearing. It was Lily, Tobias' daughter, her wide eyes fixed on Ember. "Hello, Mr. Whitaker," Lily said shyly, stepping closer. Can I pet him?" Henry hesitated, glancing at Ember. The fox's ears were pricked, his body tense, but he didn't growl or back away. Henry nodded. "Go on, then. But be gentle." Lily knelt down, her hand trembling as she reached out to stroke Ember's fur. The fox sniffed her fingers, then leaned into her touch, his tail wagging gently. Lily's face lit up with a smile. "He's beautiful," she said, her voice filled with awe. "I've never seen a fox so close before." Henry watched the interaction with a mixture of pride and sadness. Lily's innocence and curiosity reminded him of the bond he shared with Ember, a bond that had brought so much joy into his life. But it also reminded him of the fragility of that bond, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, Henry and Ember made their way back to the cottage. The walk was slower than usual, Henry's steps heavy with the weight of his thoughts. Ember stayed close, his presence a steady comfort. That night, as Henry sat by the fire with Ember curled up at his feet, he made a silent promise. No matter what happened, he would do everything in his power to ensure Ember's safety and happiness. The fox had given him so much: companionship, purpose, and a reason to keep going, and Henry would not let that gift go to waste. But as the flames flickered and the wind howled outside, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that their time together was running out. The future loomed like a storm on the horizon, and Henry knew that sooner or later, he would have to face it. As the bond between Henry and Ember grew stronger, so too did the unease among the villagers of Pine Hollow. What had once been a source of curiosity and mild admiration began to stir whispers of concern and fear. A wild fox, no matter how loyal, was still a wild animal, and the villagers couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before Ember's instincts took over. The first sign of trouble came one chilly morning when Henry and Ember ventured into the village to trade for supplies. Ember trotted beside Henry as usual, his fiery coat catching the sunlight and his amber eyes scanning the surroundings with quiet alertness. The villagers watched from a distance, their expressions a mix of fascination and apprehension. As Henry approached the general store, a group of children gathered nearby, their eyes wide with curiosity. One boy, bolder than the rest, stepped forward and reached out to touch Ember. The fox tensed, his ears flattening slightly, and let out a low growl. The boy jumped back, startled, and the other children scattered, their laughter turning to nervous chatter. Henry knelt down and placed a calming hand on Ember's back. "Easy, lad," he murmured. "They mean no harm." But the damage was done. The boy's mother, a sharp-tongued woman named Martha, stormed over, her face flushed with anger. "Henry Whitaker, you ought to keep that beast on a leash," she snapped. "It's not safe to have a wild animal roaming the village." Henry straightened, his jaw tightening. "Ember's no threat," he said firmly. "He's never harmed a soul." Martha crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Not yet, maybe. But what happens when he decides he's had enough? You can't tame a wild thing, Henry. It's only a matter of time before he turns on you, or worse, on one of us." The other villagers murmured in agreement, their unease palpable. Henry felt a surge of frustration, but he held his tongue. He knew arguing would only make things worse. Instead, he nodded curtly and led Ember away, the fox's tail swishing in agitation. The incident marked a turning point in the villagers' perception of Ember. What had once been a charming oddity now became a source of tension and fear. The whispers grew louder, and Henry found himself increasingly isolated. Even Tobias, who had always been friendly, began to keep his distance. "It's not that I don't trust you, Henry," Tobias said one evening, as they stood outside the tavern. "But folks are scared. They don't understand why you'd keep a fox as a pet. It's just unnatural." Henry sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Ember's not a pet, Tobias. He's family. And he's never given anyone reason to fear him." Tobias hesitated, then placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. "I know that, Henry. But not everyone sees it the way you do. You might want to think about, well, finding a different arrangement. For your sake, and for Ember's." Henry didn't respond, but the words weighed heavily on him. He knew Tobias meant well, but the idea of parting with Ember was unthinkable. The fox had become his constant companion, his source of comfort and joy. To give him up would be like losing a part of himself. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the village continued to grow. Some villagers began to avoid Henry altogether, crossing to the other side of the street when they saw him coming. Others whispered behind his back, their eyes darting nervously to Ember, who always stayed close to Henry's side. One evening, as Henry and Ember returned from a walk in the forest, they found a note pinned to the door of the cottage. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was clear: keep that fox away from the village, or there'll be trouble. Henry crumpled the note in his hand, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and fear. He knew the villagers' unease was reaching a boiling point, and he couldn't ignore the danger it posed to Ember. That night, as he sat by the fire with Ember curled up at his feet, Henry's mind raced. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Ember, but he also couldn't risk the fox's safety. The villagers' fear was a powerful force, and Henry knew it could easily turn to violence if provoked. "What am I going to do, lad?" Henry murmured, scratching Ember behind the ears. The fox looked up at him, his amber eyes filled with trust and loyalty. Henry's heart ached at the sight. The next morning, Henry made a decision. He would keep Ember away from the village, at least for a while. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best he could do to protect the fox from the villagers' growing hostility. As the weeks passed, Henry and Ember spent more and more time in the forest, away from prying eyes and whispered accusations. The isolation was difficult, but it also brought a strange sense of peace. In the quiet of the woods, Henry and Ember could be themselves, free from the judgment and fear of others. But even in the forest, the shadow of the villagers' unease loomed. Henry knew it was only a matter of time before the situation came to a head. The question was, what would happen when it did? The seasons turned, and with them, Henry's health began to falter. The once sturdy old man who had braved storms and long walks through the forest now moved with a noticeable slowness. His hands, once steady as they chopped wood or tended to Ember, now trembled with the weight of age. The villagers, though still wary of Ember, couldn't help but notice the change in Henry. Whispers of concern began to replace the murmurs of fear, though they were tinged with a sense of inevitability. Henry himself was acutely aware of his decline. Each morning, it took him longer to rise from his bed, his joints stiff and aching. The walks through the forest, once a daily ritual, became shorter and less frequent. Ember, ever loyal, stayed close to Henry's side, his amber eyes filled with a quiet understanding. The fox seemed to sense Henry's frailty, often nudging him gently or curling up beside him as if to offer comfort. One crisp autumn afternoon, Henry sat on the porch of his cottage, a blanket draped over his shoulders to ward off the chill. Ember lay at his feet, his fiery coat a stark contrast to the golden leaves that carpeted the ground. Henry's gaze was distant, his thoughts heavy with the weight of his mortality. "Getting old, Ember," Henry murmured, his voice rough but soft. "Not much time left, I reckon." Ember lifted his head, his ears twitching at the sound of Henry's voice. He let out a soft whine, his amber eyes locking onto Henry's with an intensity that made the old man's chest tighten. Henry reached down to scratch behind Ember's ears, his fingers trembling slightly. "You've been a good lad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I worry about you. What'll you do when I'm gone?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Ember tilted his head, as if trying to understand the weight of Henry's words. He pressed his muzzle against Henry's hand, a gesture of comfort that brought a lump to the old man's throat. The villagers, though still uneasy about Ember, began to show small acts of kindness toward Henry. Tobias brought over a pot of stew one evening, his expression a mix of concern and guilt. "Thought you might like something warm," he said, setting the pot on the table. "You've been looking tired." Henry nodded, his gratitude evident despite his weariness. "Thank you, Tobias. That's kind of you." Tobias hesitated, his gaze flicking to Ember, who lay by the hearth, watching them with quiet alertness. "Henry, have you thought about what'll happen to him?" he asked, his voice careful. When you're not around anymore." Henry's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. He had thought about it, more than he cared to admit. The idea of Ember being left alone, vulnerable to the villagers' fear or the dangers of the forest, was a constant ache in his heart. "I don't know," Henry admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what'll become of him. Tobias sighed, running a hand through his hair. There's a sanctuary up north, he said slowly. They take in animals like Ember. Give them a safe place to live. Maybe that's an option. Henry's chest tightened at the thought. A sanctuary sounded like a good solution, but the idea of sending Ember away, of breaking the bond they had built, was almost too much to bear. He looked at Ember, who was now dozing by the fire, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. I'll think on it, Henry said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. As the days passed, Henry's health continued to decline. The walks through the forest became rare, and even simple tasks like chopping wood or tending to the garden became insurmountable challenges. Ember, ever watchful, stayed close to Henry, his presence a constant source of comfort. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was bathed in a soft, golden light, Henry sat on the porch with Ember at his side. The air was cool, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the sky. Henry's breathing was shallow, his hands resting on his knees as he gazed out at the trees. You've been a good friend, Ember, Henry said softly, his voice trembling. Better than I ever deserved. Ember let out a soft whine, pressing his muzzle against Henry's hand. The old man smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't know what's coming, Henry continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But I want you to know. You've made my life better. You've given me something to hold on to, even when things were dark. Ember's amber eyes locked onto Henry's, filled with a quiet understanding. The fox leaned into Henry's touch, his body warm and steady against the old man's trembling hand. As the night deepened and the stars filled the sky, Henry and Ember sat together in silence, the bond between them stronger than ever. But beneath the surface of that quiet moment, a storm was brewing, a storm that would test the limits of their loyalty and love. The winter came early that year, its icy grip tightening around Pine Hollow with a ferocity that left the villagers huddled in their homes. Snow blanketed the forest, muffling the sounds of the world and turning Henry's cottage into a lonely island in a sea of white. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls as Henry lay in his bed, his breathing shallow and labored. Ember lay beside him, his fiery coat a stark contrast to the pale sheets. The fox's amber eyes were fixed on Henry's face, filled with a quiet intensity that spoke of understanding and sorrow. He had not left Henry's side for days, his presence a constant source of comfort as the old man's strength ebbed away. Henry's hand trembled as he reached out to stroke Ember's fur. You've been a good lad, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The best friend I could have asked for. Ember let out a soft whine, pressing his muzzle against Henry's hand. The old man smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He knew his time was running out, and the thought of leaving Ember alone filled him with a deep, aching sadness. The villagers, though still wary of Ember, had begun to show small acts of kindness toward Henry in his final days. Tobias brought over a pot of soup, his expression a mix of concern and guilt. Thought you might like something warm, he said, setting the pot on the table. You've been looking tired. Henry nodded, his gratitude evident despite his weariness. Thank you, Tobias. That's kind of you. Tobias hesitated, his gaze flicking to Ember, who lay by the hearth, watching them with quiet alertness. Henry. Have you thought about what'll happen to him? He asked, his voice careful. When you're not around anymore? Henry's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. He had thought about it, more than he cared to admit. The idea of Ember being left alone, vulnerable to the villagers' fear or the dangers of the forest, was a constant ache in his heart. I don't know, Henry admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what'll become of him. Tobias sighed, running a hand through his hair. There's a sanctuary up north, he said slowly. They take in animals like Ember. Give them a safe place to live. Maybe that's an option. Henry's chest tightened at the thought. A sanctuary sounded like a good solution, but the idea of sending Ember away, of breaking the bond they had built, was almost too much to bear. He looked at Ember, who was now dozing by the fire, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. "I'll think on it," Henry said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. As the days passed, Henry's health continued to decline. The walks through the forest became rare, and even simple tasks like chopping wood or tending to the garden became insurmountable challenges. Ember, ever watchful, stayed close to Henry, his presence a constant source of comfort. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was bathed in a soft, golden light, Henry sat on the porch with Ember at his side. The air was cool, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the sky. Henry's breathing was shallow, his hands resting on his knees as he gazed out at the trees. "You've been a good friend, Ember," Henry said softly, his voice trembling. "Better than I ever deserved." Ember let out a soft whine, pressing his muzzle against Henry's hand. The old man smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know what's coming," Henry continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I want you to know. You've made my life better. You've given me something to hold on to, even when things were dark." Ember's amber eyes locked onto Henry's, filled with a quiet understanding. The fox leaned into Henry's touch, his body warm and steady against the old man's trembling hand. As the night deepened and the stars filled the sky, Henry and Ember sat together in silence, the bond between them stronger than ever. But beneath the surface of that quiet moment, a storm was brewing, a storm that would test the limits of their loyalty and love. The morning after Henry's passing, the village of Pine Hollow awoke to a world blanketed in snow. The air was still, the kind of stillness that comes only in the deepest winter, when even the wind seems to hold its breath. Inside Henry's cottage, the fire had long since burned out, leaving the room cold and silent. Ember lay beside Henry's bed, his amber eyes fixed on the old man's still form. He had not moved since Henry's last breath, his body curled tightly against the edge of the bed as if trying to keep his friend warm. When Tobias arrived later that morning, he found the cottage quiet and cold. He pushed open the door cautiously, his breath visible in the frosty air. "Henry?" he called softly, though he already knew what he would find. Ember lifted his head at the sound of Tobias' voice, his ears twitching. He let out a low, mournful whine, the sound echoing through the empty cottage. Tobias stepped inside, his heart heavy as he approached the bed. He placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, confirming what he already knew. The old man was gone. Tobias sighed, running a hand through his hair. He glanced at Ember, who was watching him with a mixture of sorrow and defiance. The fox's amber eyes were filled with a quiet intensity, as if daring Tobias to come closer. "I'm sorry, boy," Tobias murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I know you loved him." Ember let out another soft whine, his gaze returning to Henry's face. Tobias hesitated, then reached out to stroke the fox's fur. Ember didn't pull away, but he didn't lean into the touch either. His loyalty was to Henry, and Henry alone. The villagers gathered later that day to prepare for Henry's funeral. It was a modest affair, as Henry would have wanted, with a simple wooden coffin and a grave dug beneath the old oak tree where he and Ember had often sat together. The snow made the task difficult, but the villagers worked in silence, their breath visible in the cold air. Ember watched from a distance, his fiery coat a stark contrast to the white snow. He had followed the procession to the cemetery, his steps slow and deliberate. The villagers eyed him warily, but no one dared to approach. There was something about the fox's presence, something solemn and reverent, that kept them at bay. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, Ember let out a long, mournful howl. The sound echoed through the cemetery, sending shivers down the spines of everyone present. It was a sound of pure grief, a lament that seemed to come from the very depths of the fox's soul. The villagers stood in silence, their heads bowed. Even those who had feared Ember couldn't help but be moved by the depth of his sorrow. When the howl faded, the only sound was the soft crunch of snow underfoot as the villagers began to disperse. But Ember didn't leave. He stayed by the grave, his body curled tightly against the cold earth. The villagers watched from a distance, their unease mingling with a strange sense of awe. The fox's loyalty was undeniable, and it stirred something in them, something they couldn't quite name. Days turned into weeks, and still Ember remained at Henry's grave. The villagers brought food and water, leaving it at a respectful distance, but the fox refused to eat. His once gleaming coat grew dull, and his body became gaunt from lack of sustenance. Yet he stayed, his amber eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross that marked Henry's resting place. Lily, Tobias' daughter, was one of the few who dared to approach Ember. She had always been fascinated by the fox, and the sight of him grieving broke her heart. One afternoon, she brought a bowl of warm broth and set it near the grave. Ember lifted his head, his ears twitching, but he didn't move. "Please, Ember," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "You have to eat. Henry wouldn't want you to starve." The fox let out a soft whine, his gaze locking onto Lily's. For a moment, it seemed as if he might respond, but then he lowered his head again, his body trembling with exhaustion. Lily's eyes filled with tears. She knelt in the snow, her hands clasped in front of her. "I don't know if you can understand me," she said softly. "But I want you to know. You're not alone. We care about you. Henry cared about you. And he'd want you to live." Ember didn't respond, but his ears twitched, as if he were listening. Lily stayed with him for a while, her presence a quiet comfort in the cold stillness of the cemetery. When she finally left, she glanced back at the fox, her heart heavy with worry. As the days passed, the villagers' unease grew. They couldn't understand why Ember refused to leave the grave, why he seemed determined to waste away beside it. Some whispered that the fox was cursed, that his loyalty was unnatural. Others, like Lily and Tobias, saw it as a testament to the bond between man and beast, a bond that transcended even death. But for Ember, there was no question. Henry had been his world, and without him, the world felt empty. The fox's vigil was not just an act of loyalty, it was an expression of love, a final farewell to the man who had given him everything. The days grew colder, and Ember's vigil at Henry's grave became a haunting symbol of loyalty and loss in Pine Hollow. The villagers, though still uneasy about the fox, couldn't ignore the depth of his devotion. Even those who had once feared him now spoke in hushed tones about the fox that wouldn't leave. Children whispered stories of Ember's bravery, while adults debated what should be done about him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cemetery was bathed in a soft, golden light, a stranger arrived in Pine Hollow. She was a tall woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, her boots crunching through the snow as she made her way to Tobias' farm. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Grant, and she was the director of a wildlife sanctuary located several hours north of the village. Tobias greeted her at the door, his expression a mix of curiosity and relief. "Dr. Grant," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." Dr. Grant shook his hand firmly, her gaze steady. "I came as soon as I heard," she said. "Where's the fox?" Tobias led her to the cemetery, where Ember still lay by Henry's grave. The fox's once fiery coat was now dull and matted, his body gaunt from weeks of refusing food. Dr. Grant knelt at a respectful distance, her sharp eyes studying Ember with a mix of concern and admiration. "He's been like this for weeks," Tobias explained, his voice heavy with emotion. "Won't eat, won't leave. We've tried everything, but... well, you can see for yourself." Dr. Grant nodded, her expression thoughtful. "He's grieving," she said simply. Animals feel loss just as deeply as we do. But he can't stay here. If he doesn't eat soon, he'll die. Tobias sighed, running a hand through his hair. We've tried to get him to eat, but he won't take anything from us. It's like he's waiting for Henry to come back. Dr. Grant's gaze softened. He's not waiting for Henry, she said gently. He's saying goodbye. But he needs help to move on. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small container of food, specially prepared for wild animals. She placed it near Ember, then stepped back, her movements slow and deliberate. The fox lifted his head, his amber eyes flicking toward the food, but he didn't move. It's not going to be easy, Dr. Grant said, her voice low. But if we can get him to the sanctuary, we can give him a chance to heal. He'll be safe there, surrounded by others like him. It's the best option he has. Tobias nodded, though his heart ached at the thought of sending Ember away. He knew it was the right thing to do, but it felt like losing a part of Henry all over again. The next morning, Dr. Grant returned to the cemetery with a team from the sanctuary. They brought a large crate and a tranquilizer gun, though they hoped to avoid using it if possible. Ember watched them warily, his body tense, but he didn't growl or lash out. It was as if he understood that they were there to help. Lily stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had begged her father to let her come, and Tobias had reluctantly agreed. The sight of Ember, so thin and frail, brought tears to her eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please let them help you." Dr. Grant approached Ember slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. She knelt a few feet away, holding out a piece of food. "It's okay," she said softly. "We're here to help." Ember's ears twitched, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might respond. But then he lowered his head again, his body trembling with exhaustion. Dr. Grant sighed and glanced at her team. "We'll have to sedate him," she said quietly. "It's the only way." The team moved quickly, their movements efficient and practiced. One of them aimed the tranquilizer gun, and with a soft thwip, the dart found its mark. Ember let out a startled yelp, his body stiffening, but within moments, the sedative took effect. He slumped to the ground, his breathing slow and steady. Lily let out a choked sob, her hands covering her mouth. Tobias placed a comforting arm around her shoulders, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Dr. Grant and her team carefully lifted Ember into the crate, their movements gentle and respectful. As they carried him to the van, Lily stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Will he be okay?" Dr. Grant nodded, her expression kind but firm. "We'll do everything we can for him," she said. "He'll have a safe place to heal, and he won't be alone. It's the best chance he has." Lily nodded, though her heart ached. She reached out to touch the crate, her fingers brushing against the wood. "Goodbye, Ember," she whispered. "Take care of yourself." As the van pulled away, the villagers stood in silence, their breath visible in the cold air. The cemetery felt emptier without Ember's presence, and the weight of his absence was palpable. But as the van disappeared down the snowy road, a sense of hope began to stir. Ember was on his way to a new beginning, a chance to heal and find peace. And though the journey ahead would be difficult, it was a journey worth taking. The drive to the sanctuary was long and quiet, the van winding through snow-covered roads as the forest gave way to rolling hills and open fields. Inside the crate, Ember lay still, his breathing slow and steady from the sedative. Dr. Grant sat nearby, her sharp eyes occasionally flicking to the fox, her expression a mix of concern and determination. When they finally arrived at the sanctuary, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the sprawling grounds. The sanctuary was a peaceful place, with large enclosures designed to mimic natural habitats and a team of dedicated staff who cared for the animals with unwavering compassion. Dr. Grant and her team carried Ember's crate to a secluded enclosure, one designed specifically for foxes. It was spacious, with tall grasses, rocky outcroppings, and a small stream running through it. The enclosure was surrounded by a high fence, ensuring Ember's safety while giving him the freedom to roam. As the sedative began to wear off, Ember stirred, his amber eyes blinking open. He let out a soft whine, his body trembling as he took in his unfamiliar surroundings. Dr. Grant knelt nearby, her voice calm and reassuring. "It's okay, Ember," she said softly. "You're safe here. This is your new home." The fox's ears twitched, and he let out another whine, his gaze darting around the enclosure. He seemed confused, disoriented, and Dr. Grant's heart ached for him. She knew the transition would be difficult, but she also knew it was necessary. Over the next few days, the sanctuary staff worked tirelessly to help Ember adjust. They provided him with fresh food and water, though he refused to eat at first. They spoke to him in gentle tones, trying to build trust, but the fox remained wary, his amber eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. Dr. Grant spent hours observing Ember, her sharp mind analyzing his behavior. She had seen animals grieve before, but Ember's devotion to Henry was unlike anything she had encountered. It was as if the fox's entire world had revolved around the old man, and without him, Ember was lost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sanctuary was bathed in a soft, golden light, Dr. Grant sat outside Ember's enclosure, her notebook in hand. The fox lay nearby, his body curled tightly against the cold ground. He had barely moved all day, his amber eyes fixed on the horizon as if searching for something, or someone. Dr. Grant sighed, her pen hovering over the page. She had tried everything to help Ember, but nothing seemed to work. The fox's grief was a wall she couldn't breach, and it left her feeling helpless. Just then, one of the sanctuary's older foxes, a female named Willow, approached Ember's enclosure. Willow had been at the sanctuary for years, her once wild spirit tempered by age and experience. She had a calm, nurturing presence, and Dr. Grant had often seen her comfort younger or more troubled animals. Willow sat near the fence, her amber eyes fixed on Ember. She let out a soft, low whine, a sound that seemed to carry both sympathy and understanding. Ember lifted his head, his ears twitching. For a moment, the two foxes simply looked at each other, their gazes locked in a silent exchange. Then, to Dr. Grant's surprise, Ember stood and slowly approached the fence. He sniffed the air, his body tense but curious. Willow remained still, her presence a quiet reassurance. After a long moment, Ember let out a soft whine of his own, his tail swishing gently. Dr. Grant watched in awe as the two foxes began to interact, their movements cautious but deliberate. It was a small step, but it was a step forward, a glimmer of hope in the midst of Ember's grief. Over the next few days, Ember and Willow's bond grew stronger. The older fox seemed to sense Ember's pain, and she stayed close to him, offering comfort in her own quiet way. Ember began to eat again, his appetite slowly returning as he adjusted to his new surroundings. Dr. Grant documented every change, her heart swelling with pride and relief. Ember was far from healed, but he was beginning to find his footing. The sanctuary had given him a safe place to grieve, and Willow had given him a reason to keep going. As the weeks passed, Ember's transformation became more evident. His coat regained its fiery luster, and his amber eyes, though still tinged with sorrow, began to sparkle with life once more. He explored his enclosure with cautious curiosity, his movements growing more confident with each passing day. But even as Ember began to heal, Dr. Grant knew his journey was far from over. The fox's bond with Henry had been profound, and the scars of that loss would never fully fade. Yet, in the quiet moments when Ember and Willow sat together, their bodies pressed close and their tails entwined, Dr. Grant saw something beautiful, a testament to the resilience of the heart, both human and animal. The sanctuary became Ember's new world, a place of safety and healing, though it was a world he had not chosen. The spacious enclosure, with its tall grasses, rocky outcroppings, and babbling stream, was designed to mimic the wild, but it was still a far cry from the freedom of the forest. Ember's initial days were marked by confusion and resistance. He paced the perimeter of the enclosure, his amber eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for Henry. The food and water left out for him often went untouched, and the sanctuary staff grew increasingly concerned. Dr. Grant watched him closely, her sharp eyes noting every detail of his behavior. She had seen animals grieve before, but Ember's sorrow was profound, a deep ache that seemed to permeate his very being. She knew that forcing him to adapt would only make things worse, so she took a patient approach, allowing him the space to process his loss. Willow, the older fox who had first approached Ember, became a constant presence in his life. She was a calming influence, her quiet demeanor a stark contrast to Ember's restless energy. At first, Ember ignored her, his focus still fixed on the world beyond the enclosure. But Willow was persistent. She would sit near him, her amber eyes soft and understanding, and let out gentle whines that seemed to echo his own sorrow. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sanctuary was bathed in a soft, golden light, Ember finally responded. He turned to Willow, his ears twitching, and let out a soft whine of his own. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it marked the beginning of a fragile connection. Over the next few days, Ember and Willow began to interact more. They would sit together near the stream, their bodies close but not touching, as if drawing comfort from each other's presence. Willow would nudge Ember gently, encouraging him to eat or explore, and though he resisted at first, he slowly began to follow her lead. Dr. Grant observed these interactions with a mix of relief and hope. She knew that Ember's healing would be a slow process, but the bond forming between him and Willow was a promising sign. She began to add just his care routine, introducing enrichment activities to stimulate his mind and body. She scattered food in the grass to encourage foraging, hid treats in the rocks to spark his curiosity, and even introduced a shallow pool for him to splash in. At first, Ember showed little interest in these activities. He would sniff at the food or toys, then retreat to his favorite spot by the stream. But Willow's persistence paid off. One afternoon, as she pawed at a hidden treat, Ember watched with cautious curiosity. When she uncovered it and began to eat, he crept closer, his ears twitching. Willow stepped back, leaving the treat for him, and after a moment's hesitation, Ember took it. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Dr. Grant documented the moment in her notes, her heart swelling with pride. Ember was beginning to engage with his surroundings, to find small moments of joy amidst his grief. As the weeks passed, Ember's transformation became more evident. His coat, once dull and matted, regained its fiery luster. His body, once gaunt and frail, grew strong and healthy. He began to explore the enclosure with cautious curiosity, his movements growing more confident with each passing day. He would chase after Willow, his tail swishing playfully, or splash in the stream, his amber eyes sparkling with life. But even as Ember began to heal, Dr. Grant knew his journey was far from over. The fox's bond with Henry had been profound, and the scars of that loss would never fully fade. There were still moments when Ember would retreat to his favorite spot by the stream, his gaze distant and his body tense. In those moments, it was as if he were back at Henry's grave, his grief as raw and painful as ever. Willow seemed to sense these moments, and she would sit beside him, her presence a quiet reassurance. She didn't try to pull him out of his sorrow, she simply stayed with him, offering comfort in her own quiet way. And slowly, Ember would come back to the present, his tail swishing gently as he leaned into her warmth. Dr. Grant often found herself marveling at the bond between the two foxes. It was a testament to the resilience of the heart, both human and animal. Ember had lost everything, but he had found a new connection, a new reason to keep going. And in doing so, he had reminded everyone at the sanctuary of the power of love and loyalty. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sanctuary was bathed in a soft, golden light, Dr. Grant sat outside Ember's enclosure, her notebook in hand. The fox lay nearby, his body curled tightly against Willow's. His amber eyes were half closed, his breathing slow and steady. Dr. Grant smiled faintly, her heart swelling with pride and relief. Ember was far from healed, but he was beginning to find his footing. The sanctuary had given him a safe place to grieve, and Willow had given him a reason to keep going. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Dr. Grant closed her notebook and stood. She glanced at Ember one last time, her expression soft. "You're going to be okay, Ember," she said softly. "You've got a lot of life left in you." The fox lifted his head, his amber eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, it was as if he understood. Then he lowered his head again, his body relaxing against Willow's. Dr. Grant turned and walked away, her heart light with hope. Months had passed since Ember's arrival at the sanctuary, and the fiery fox had made remarkable progress. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, his body was strong and healthy, and his amber eyes, though still tinged with sorrow, sparkled with life once more. He had formed a deep bond with Willow, and the two foxes were often seen exploring the enclosure together, their tails swishing in unison. But despite his progress, Ember's grief for Henry lingered. There were moments when he would retreat to his favorite spot by the stream, his gaze distant and his body tense. In those moments it was as if he were back at Henry's grave, his sorrow as raw and painful as ever. Dr. Grant had always known that Ember's healing would be a slow process, but she also knew that there was one thing she could do to help him find closure. She had been in contact with Tobias and Lily, who had visited the sanctuary a few times to check on Ember. During one of their visits, Dr. Grant proposed a plan, a final farewell to Henry, one that would allow Ember to say goodbye in his own way. Tobias and Lily agreed, and arrangements were made for Ember to return to Pine Hollow for a brief visit. The sanctuary staff prepared carefully, ensuring that the trip would be as stress-free as possible for the fox. Ember was sedated lightly for the journey, and he traveled in a secure crate, with Willow by his side for comfort. When they arrived in Pine Hollow, the village was quiet, the snow-covered streets glistening in the sunlight. Tobias and Lily were waiting at the cemetery, their breath visible in the cold air. Dr. Grant and her team carried Ember's crate to Henry's grave, their movements slow and deliberate. As the sedative wore off, Ember stirred, his amber eyes blinking open. He let out a soft whine, his body trembling as he took in his surroundings. Dr. Grant knelt nearby, her voice calm and reassuring. "It's okay, Ember," she said softly. "You're safe here. This is your chance to say goodbye." The fox's ears twitched, and he let out another whine, his gaze darting around the cemetery. When his eyes landed on Henry's grave, he froze, his body tense. For a long moment, he simply stared at the simple wooden cross, his amber eyes filled with a quiet intensity. Then, slowly, Ember stepped out of the crate, his movements cautious but deliberate. He approached the grave, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. He let out a soft whine, his tail swishing gently. Lily knelt nearby, her eyes filled with tears. "It's okay, Ember," she whispered. "He's at peace now. You can let go." The fox let out a long, mournful howl, the sound echoing through the cemetery and sending shivers down the spines of everyone present. It was a sound of pure grief, a lament that seemed to come from the very depths of Ember's soul. As the howl faded, Ember lowered his head, his body trembling. He pressed his muzzle against the wooden cross, his amber eyes closing as if in prayer. For a moment it was as if he were communing with Henry, saying the goodbye he had never been able to say. Then, slowly, Ember stepped back, his tail swishing gently. He turned to Dr. Grant, his gaze steady and calm. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, a burden he had carried for so long. Dr. Grant smiled faintly, her heart swelling with pride and relief. "You're going to be okay, Ember," she said softly. "You've said your goodbye. Now it's time to move forward." The fox let out a soft whine, his tail wagging gently. He glanced at Willow, who had been watching from a distance, and trotted over to her, his movements light and confident. The two foxes nuzzled each other, their bond stronger than ever. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the cemetery was bathed in a soft, golden light, Dr. Grant and her team prepared to leave. Ember and Willow were loaded back into the crate, their bodies pressed close together. Lily knelt by the crate, her hand resting on the wood. "Goodbye, Ember," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Take care of yourself." The van pulled away, the sound of its engine fading into the distance. The villagers stood in silence, their breath visible in the cold air. The cemetery felt emptier without Ember's presence, but there was also a sense of peace, as if a chapter had finally been closed. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Lily and Tobias stood by Henry's grave, their hearts heavy but hopeful. Ember had found closure, and in doing so, he had reminded them all of the power of love and loyalty. The drive back to the sanctuary was quiet, the van winding through snow-covered roads as the forest gave way to rolling hills and open fields. Inside the crate, Ember lay beside Willow, his body relaxed and his breathing slow and steady. The visit to Henry's grave had been emotional, but it had also been cathartic. Ember had said his goodbye, and in doing so, he had taken the first step toward a new beginning. When they arrived at the sanctuary, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the sprawling grounds. Dr. Grant and her team carried Ember's crate to his enclosure, their movements slow and deliberate. The fox stepped out cautiously, his amber eyes scanning his surroundings with quiet curiosity. Willow followed close behind, her presence a steady comfort. The two foxes nuzzled each other, their bond stronger than ever. Ember let out a soft whine, his tail swishing gently, and Willow responded with a gentle nudge. Over the next few days, Ember's transformation became more evident. He explored the enclosure with renewed energy, his movements light and confident. He splashed in the stream, chased after Willow, and even began to interact with the enrichment activities Dr. Grant had set up for him. Dr. Grant watched him closely, her sharp eyes noting every detail of his behavior. She had seen animals grieve before, but Ember's journey had been particularly profound. His bond with Henry had been deep and unbreakable, and the scars of that loss would never fully fade. But Ember was beginning to find joy in his new life, and that was a victory in itself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sanctuary was bathed in a soft, golden light, Dr. Grant sat outside Ember's enclosure, her notebook in hand. The fox lay nearby, his body curled tightly against Willow's. His amber eyes were half closed, his breathing slow and steady. Dr. Grant smiled faintly, her heart swelling with pride and relief. Ember was far from healed, but he was beginning to find his footing. The sanctuary had given him a safe place to grieve, and Willow had given him a reason to keep going. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Dr. Grant closed her notebook and stood. She glanced at Ember one last time, her expression soft. "You're going to be okay, Ember," she said softly. "You've got a lot of life left in you." The fox lifted his head, his amber eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, it was as if he understood. Then he lowered his head again, his body relaxing against Willow's. Dr. Grant turned and walked away, her heart light with hope. The years passed, and Ember's story became a legend at the sanctuary. Visitors would often stop by his enclosure, drawn by the tale of the fox who had mourned so deeply and loved so fiercely. Ember, now older but still vibrant, would often sit by the stream, his amber eyes calm and content. Willow, ever by his side, had become his constant companion, their bond a testament to the resilience of the heart. Dr. Grant often found herself reflecting on Ember's journey. The fox had taught her, and everyone at the sanctuary, about the depth of love and loyalty that animals were capable of. His story had inspired countless visitors, reminding them of the power of compassion and the importance of giving animals a second chance. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the sun cast a golden glow over the sanctuary, Dr. Grant sat outside Ember's enclosure, her notebook in hand. The fox lay nearby, his body curled tightly against Willow's. His amber eyes were half closed, his breathing slow and steady. Dr. Grant smiled faintly, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. Ember had come so far, and his journey had touched so many lives. He had found peace, and in doing so, he had left a lasting legacy. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Dr. Grant closed her notebook and stood. She glanced at Ember one last time, her expression soft. "You've done well, Ember," she said softly. "You've reminded us all of what it means to love and to heal." The fox lifted his head, his amber eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, it was as if he understood. Then he lowered his head again, his body relaxing against Willow's. Dr. Grant turned and walked away, her heart light with hope and gratitude. Ember's story was far from over, but it was a story of love, loyalty, and resilience, a story that would continue to inspire for generations to come.